So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's lecture at the Center for Armenian Studies. I'm Gottfried Hagen. I'm the director of the center. Today's event is a remarkable sort of instance of collaboration of various units across campus. I'm not sure we had that many co-sponsors ever on a flyer. So let me just start by thanking the Institute for the Humanities, the DEI office of the College for Literature, Sciences, and the Arts, the Center for Racial Justice, the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, the Program in Arab and Muslim American Studies, and the Department of American Culture, and who have actually been sort of the first initiators of this of today's event. And so it's my pleasure to turn the podium over to my colleague Sarah Awartani, who will introduce today's speaker.
I'm just going to hold it because otherwise it'll be chaos, right? I'm Sarah Awartani. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of American Culture, Latino Studies, and Arab and Muslim American Studies. Thomas and I know each other from way, way back. We went to graduate school together, so I'm really delighted to brought him to campus today. So for a little bio, Thomas is currently writing an institutional history of the Armenian General Benevolent Union and is also affiliated faculty in the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies at Emory, as well as the Center for Arts, Migration, and Entrepreneurship at the University of Florida. And Thomas knows this is coming. That's my undergraduate alma mater. So even though he doesn't care, I'm morally obligated to say, go Gators. Thomas previously served as a Fulbright U.S. teaching scholar at the American University in Cairo. After receiving degrees from Yale, New York University, and George Washington University. In addition to this already impressive work, Thomas is actively engaged in public education across the country, including writing K through 12 curriculum in California, Georgia, and New York. And he engages in robust public-facing work, including publications in Newsweek, CNN, Variety, and NPR, all in just this past year. So Thomas, thank you so much for taking time out of your always busy schedule in a very chaotic week to be here in community with us.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Let me get this lavalier. I assume this is right. Good, but whatever. So first I want to thank my friend and colleague, Dr. Awartani, for bringing me, as well as Vika Muradian in Armenian Studies for really making this possible. Shout out to Dr. Gocek, who's also been a longtime friend and mentor, if I may, I've also been grateful for support that I've gotten from the Bentley Library, from the Philip Kayal Fund for Arab American Research, at the Center for Arab Philanthropy, the Arab American National Museum, and my many relatives in Detroit. So it's nice to come back, and it's an interesting and fascinating place for me. It's nice to be back and always feel more and more myself. I'm very, very nicely supported. Okay, so on to the main event. So in March, the White House unexpectedly announced major adjustments to its race and ethnicity standards, the first such change in 27 years, by adding a Middle Eastern or North African, or MENA, category. Okay. Okay. So the proposal to create this category actually dates back to the Clinton administration. But as we'll see, this was actually a category that the census had long been using really for decades to track Arab, Armenian, and Iranian Americans. Activists, however, had long sought this category as a means to disaggregate these groups officially from within the broader white category where most, though not all, of these peoples had previously been lumped. In fact, it appeared as if the category would appear on the 2020 census until the first Trump administration eliminated it. So just to give you a brief kind of image, this is Yalla Count, organized by Access, the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services, as well as the Arab American National Museum in Detroit, or Dearborn, I should say, and High Count, another kind of similar initiative among Armenian Americans. So this category built on not only decades of organizing, but also more than a century of attempts by the US government to define and often vilify the MENA region through legislation, judicial cases, or executive orders. These policies haven't occurred in a vacuum, however, and I can say from personal experience that career policymakers and Americans of all stripes rely on a mix of pop culture, domestic and foreign policy concerns, and often personal experience or anecdote to understand this category, or I should say misunderstand this category. Moreover, many rightfully interpreted the category's announcement as political theater, coming as it did during the White House's inability to secure guests for its annual iftar during the escalating genocide in Gaza. Moreover, the largest Arab, Armenian, and Iranian lobbies immediately expressed disappointment with this category and its idiosyncratic exclusions, which we'll come back to more later. So it's a truism to say that race is a construct, right? That this essential insight has sometimes become little more than platitude. Like any ideology, let alone one central to Western modernity, I would argue that while it's easy to scorn and shun racism, it's far harder for us to truly shed our assumptions about race. And this is what I want us to do today. In other words, while I believe the MENA category's benefits outweigh its liabilities, I want to caution us against endorsing it as rectifying a classificatory error that reflects an ontological reality. Meaning that on some level, the category got at a more real reality, right, that we just previously not quite known. Rather than treat the category as political, pedagogical, performative, perhaps in all senses of those words. At the same time, a major thrust of deconstructionist and post-colonial thinking is that categories like the Middle East are contingent, subject to interpretation, change, and power, and therefore demand deconstruction and scrutiny. And a corollary critique is that of area studies via folks like Edward Said and Orientalism. As a discipline historically reliant on positivism, many of us like Said are kind of the uneasy inheritors of the ambivalent inheritors of the sort of traditions of Western Enlightenment and rationalism, even as we're engaged in this imminent critique. So I want to also challenge us to similarly interrogate our assumptions about the Middle East, and expand Said's critique to understand that our quarries should be the distorting imbrications of knowledge and power, however and wherever they occur. So rather than wax broadly on knowledge, today I want to walk through, this is also typically problematically ambitious, so bear with me, but an introduction to the confluence of race, the Middle East, and policy. I want to show that we can really only begin to understand these intersections through careful attention to those categories I mentioned: domestic and foreign policy concerns, popular culture, and particularly the academy. I also want to pay careful attention to the tension between how communities have defined themselves versus how they're defined by others, and hold on to the potentially productive value of ambiguity, competing definitions, and the need for both temporal and geographic scope and specificity. We'll see this in practice. I also want to offer the caveat that while there are extensive histories of people thinking about the region, beginning with Herodotus and continuing through medieval chanson, Baroque opera, European Ottoman alliances, really my focus is going to be on the 20th century and particularly on US-centered discourse, although drawing on, again, kind of Atlantic world or Euro-American thought generally. Moreover, as an American category, I argue that the constructiveness of the Middle East, race, and policy can best be understood through diaspora here. That means I'm primarily engaging Arab, Armenian, and Iranian communities, peoples that have been the majority, demographic majorities in the United States for the last century, and particularly from regions that had been part of the Ottoman and Persian empires. Again, this is not to say that this is the extent or exhaust the possibility for these identities, but just that these are the ones that I'm focusing on, given my training as an Americanist, and the fact that we're looking at, again, an American category. Similarly, it would be incredibly useful, and someone should do the work of looking at Russian Orientalism, Soviet Orientalism, Turkish Orientalism. That's beyond the scope of the talk, but just to say that those are fields that are worthy of study that certainly are in conversation with this. Wow. The talk is already probably surveilled by someone. Okay, so terms like the Middle or Near East emerged at the end of the 19th century. Although the American strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan is often credited with coining the term in 1902, the Middle East was actually already in relatively common usage in diplomatic and academic circles in the last decades of the 19th century. For Mahan, however, the Middle East usually referred to an area from Arabia to what is now present-day Afghanistan on the approach to the British Raj, while the Near East encompassed the Balkans, Asia Minor, the Levant, effectively the Ottoman Empire. Thus, when the earliest programs to study the region formed in the 1920s and 30s, they were largely near, not Middle East. And this is a small semantic difference that persists in places like Princeton, Yale, Chicago, NYU, and I understand until somewhat recently here. So these programs often prioritized Turkish, Persian, and Arabic study with lesser attention to Armenian or biblical languages like Aramaic or Hebrew. Moreover, I just want to name from the get-go, by this logic, the overwhelming majority of Americans from this part of the world would have been classified as near, not Middle Eastern. These designations were never quite equivalent in English and French, German, Spanish, Russian, the languages of the major colonial powers of the time period. So again, in other words, they didn't agree in terms of semantics, they didn't agree in terms of nomenclature and definitions, geographic boundaries. Where they were closer, and what many use to this day, is Orient or Near Orient. Hence our continued usage of terms like Oriental rugs, Oriental Orthodox churches as opposed to Eastern Orthodox churches in English, while Oriental has otherwise fallen out of common usage as a racial category because it's now seen as being a pejorative or a slur. These powers also agreed on a worldview that privileged Europeans, east of what, after all, but more to the point it emphasized empire. And here I just want to remind you, this is what empire looked like in 1914. So we can see that the vast majority of the world was in imperial systems. The British Raj, the Russian Empire, American Empire, even the Ottoman and Persian empires, right, were the dominant paradigms for mapping the world's geographies. Thus, why the Near East followed the Ottomans into their admittedly waning territories in the Balkans, but Easternness referred in some vague way to territories that were ruled by non-Christians or had large non-Christian communities. Just as a reminder for all of us, here's the Ottoman Empire, 1899, and its administrative divisions. There's a lot of like shuffling around. So again, this is not to really make any kind of a comment on administrative divisions, but just to say a reminder, this is the part of the world we're talking about. Of course, rank and file Americans also encountered the Orient through popular culture in places like the World's Fairs, especially the infamous 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition, which took up preeminent assumptions about the region as either Holy Land or Egypt, and launched the infamous American obsession with belly dance via a dancer or a series of dancers who all took the moniker Little Egypt. So our biggest hint at race, and this is an example from Chicago, this is the Midway, the Cairo street that was recreated. Here are, so Little Egypt, there was never one Little Egypt, and there were multiple dancers who claimed that they were actually the original Little Egypt. Incidentally, none of them were Egyptian, right? They were the ones who claimed this were a mix of Armenian, Greek, Arab, Sephardic Jewish, right? So many, many, many people took this up. So that already tells us something about the fungibility of these peoples, at least in popular culture. But more on that later. Our only kind of hint at race, though, in this moment was in terms of Egypt. And Americans were already, there's a lot of discourse at the end of the 19th century, obsessing over whether Egypt was white or black, right? So Americans of all stripes, then as now, are interested in claiming Egypt. And there also was a substantial discourse around white slavery, especially in the Ottoman harem, that tantalized Americans, who widely interpreted the Balkans, Caucasus, Mashriq, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, North Africa, as white, and therefore could be enslaved, and could be white slaves. Well, I'll go back. I don't want to spoil that surprise. So these, for a paragraph, these questions were never disconnected from religion, but in really far more ambivalent ways than we might imagine. So in particular, Western and Ottoman discourse demonstrated profound uncertainty in mapping religion onto race. So for example, in addition to commercial interests embodied in companies like Singer Manufacturing Company that made sewing machines and had a huge factory in the Ottoman Empire, many Americans encountered the Near or Middle East through missionary memoirs. And this was the spoiler. and adventure travelogues across the Orient, starting with Marco Polo. So this is just an image of, you may know the most famous colleges that are founded by American missionaries or the Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions are AUB in Beirut, AUC in Cairo, and Robert College in Istanbul. But the brunt of these, as you can see, did not survive the Armenian genocide because they were located in the Anatolian interior. As in Iran, schools like this created a pipeline for the first Arab and Armenian students to come to the United States for higher education, or as laborers in these missionaries' employ. Another kind of image that I want to build on, I'm going to have a lot of maps today. Another one that you may have seen before, may feel familiar, is this is a campaign for what becomes Near East Relief. It's initially, as you can see, the American Committee for Relief in the Near East. So you can see how this is really overlays almost exactly a geography that American missionaries and Americans kind of more broadly were already familiar with, mostly Ottoman and Persian, right? But again, it's like, I want us to think about the same map being reproduced a million times. Great. So a normative bias towards empire, majority groups, and in some cases, bad geography meant that American officials largely labeled the Arabs, Armenians, and smaller numbers of Sephardic Jews, Kurds, Turks who came to the US at the end of the 19th century as Turks. And this is true, obviously, of Latin America as well, where they're called Turcos, and that they were from Turkey and Asia, though very few, of course, were actually Turkish. The census adds Syrian as a category in 1920, but a crucial point about the census up until the second half of the 20th century is that it was conducted by census enumerators, meaning that they interpreted individuals' identities. You didn't fill it out yourself. This meant that Syrian or Turk often was an ethnic grab bag of Levantine identities. Greeks, Turks, Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, Armenians, Assyrians, who came from Turkey and Asia, Syria, Assyria. These are things that my family was all labeled on the census, for instance, meaning that like they're referring to what is present day parts of Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, and international organizations like the League of Nations also use these categories quite interchangeably. And if you look at a granular level at the archives, you'll see, oh, here is a boat of Palestinian refugees in Marseille. All of them are named Viken. They could be from Palestine, but they're likely not ethnically Arab, whatever, Nishans and Mamikons, right? So again, if you look at the record, there's like this mismatch between identities because they're being imposed by other people observing them. In a way, though, these ambiguities could work to immigrants' benefit because it meant that immigration was not terribly effective in terms of policing these identities. So stateside, for example, there was a short-lived Muslim ban in the 1890s, motivated largely, though, by a fear of polygamy, which was then a hot-button issue because of Utah's contentious incorporation in the Union in 1896. And ironically, as I know some of you are aware, this represented a confluence between American and Ottoman policy because the Ottomans also banned Muslims technically from emigrating. And in effect, what this meant was that Muslim migrants might claim Christian or non-Muslim identities at their port of departure and similarly claim non-Muslim, or again, often Christian identities at their port of arrival. And you see in the record, again, this sort of slippage between different identities in the record that includes Sephardic Jews who claim Armenian identities, you know, Turks who claim Assyrian or Armenian identities, right? So there's a real kind of misreading of these folks. Part of the consequence of this is that it means that scholars have really overemphasized the Christian demographics of these early migrants because they took the state's word on this, right? Rather than look, and if you again look at the granular level of the archives, you're like, I'm not sure that this like boarding house of Syrians in Sioux Falls is all Christian if they're all named Ahmed, right? Again, not to set traffic and stereotype, but I think likely there is some degree of dissembling happening here. And again, as we know, and Dr. Ozdemir has talked about, right, the Ottomans were far more interested in policing Armenian movement, right, as opposed to Arab movement in this time period. There were separate and distinct policies. Again, you know that better than I do. We don't need to get into the specifics, but it's all to say that there was a heightened paranoia about policing identities, but not terribly effective mechanisms for doing so. Wait a second. Okay. So this is an example. This is from students at Columbia. University in like a pre-constitutional period. So the first decade of the 20th century. Here is also from the New York Sun. There was a short-lived and long-forgotten Ottoman mosque. It was called Ottoman Mosque in downtown Manhattan in its little Syria. It's really fascinating. It's right near Alexander Russell Webb, who's a famous American convert you may have heard of, is an Ottoman consul right nearby. I was like, hello, Jake. It's interesting that we think that like likely the Imam was like doing a mix. He's a really interesting biography. I can send this to you. If you look really closely, he has a really, really interesting multinational, multi-imperial background. But we think he was likely, frankly, spying on people because the Ottoman state was also concerned about surveilling its citizens and some of their unruly activities, as any empire, as any government is. Another example, which I couldn't resist including, this is the Kohar Theater Troupe, the Hashtimagan Society of Diyarbakir Armenians in West Hoboken. This is my great uncle Nishan, who looks just like my grandfather, so it's kind of amazing. So, you know, this all to say that there are traditions largely understudied of these, again, Ottoman subjects in the US and lives they created. But again, they're navigating a particular kind of relationship to the state, to identity, and racialization. So that's all to say, not only did people like choose these false identities, right, but they often were able to navigate immigration systems that really cracked down much more harshly on South and East Asian immigrants who could be more readily identified as racially distinct. Although, of course, many of them were not Muslim, right, but they were more easily kind of differentiated from the swarm, you know, of migrants coming to the US in this time period. So for this reason, tens of thousands of Ottoman migrants, Arab, Armenian, Turkish, Sephardic, emigrated and naturalized with little issue. In fact, there were, and this is something that might feel familiar, a series of racial prerequisite cases challenging the immigration and naturalization of these people starting in 1909, with a series of cases that, contrary to what we might think, actually confirmed Arab whiteness. So these are from competing op-eds in the Times. As you can see, is the Turk a white man? And then on the right is a letter in response by a Lebanese American who basically posits like, well, the question isn't like whether Turks are white, it's actually are Turks Turks? Because of course, he's attempting to disaggregate himself from this category. And here's just a tiny list of the many legal challenges mounted against naturalization for a range of different peoples. Asian Indians, Punjabis at the distinct set, Syrians, Filipinos, Koreans, Armenians, right? There's a ton of cases here. But as I said, what I want to argue is that a lot of them confirmed whiteness, and they also came at the tail end of what were already decades of immigration. So how can this be, right? The seminal works of critical whiteness studies have taught us that people became white, whether Irish, Ashkenazi, Italian. And here I'll show my hand. I'm not convinced that critical whiteness studies hasn't done more harm than good, starting with its overprivileging of assenting court opinions, refusal to actually define whiteness, and especially relegation of the Middle East or the Near East and its peoples to little more than a footnote. More to the point, as Nell Urban Painter, Tom Guglielmo, Eric Arneson, myself, and others have attempted to show, this field has distorted the fact that these European groups were almost always categorically understood as white, though still subject to discrimination or whiteness of a different color. So I want to also emphasize that this is not how it's taken up in popular culture and the endless sort of grievance axe grinding of people who say, well, you know, actually, this group wasn't actually white. And I really want to challenge that premise for all of these groups inclusive. Because instead, if we carefully examine race science and a fuller account of race making in the first half of the 20th century, rather than becoming white, a more apt grammar would be unbecoming. And here's where we see the most parallels with the creation of this category today, this kind of new classificatory process that's occurring at the federal level. So it was primarily through slurring as Asian that the racial status and rights of Near Eastern peoples were challenged. Many of these challenges emerged in the American South and West. For example, North Carolina Senator F.M. Simmons exclaimed that Ottoman immigrants were, quote, nothing more than the degenerate progeny of the Asiatic hordes, the spawn of the Phoenician curse, end quote. In response, Arab and Armenian immigrants mobilized a range of responses, claiming Caucasian or Indo-European ancestry. Ironically, many claimed Phoenician as opposed to Arab Muslim ancestry, which still occurs today. Christian religion, right, which as we've seen, many of them may not actually have professed. Origins in the Holy Lands, difference from Turks, who they argue were the real Asiatics or the real barbarians. Their performance of whiteness through economic success or social or romantic relationships with other white Americans. However, the most successful or useful ally for these Arab and Armenian litigants were far more bedrock assumptions about race, expressed in race science. And this is really where I think we've done the least nuanced or useful examination of the time period. So this scientific racialism is both familiar and strange, since it most frequently divided the world into three main categories: Caucasoid, here in blue, Mongoloid, in yellow, and Negroid. Sometimes there was a separate race for native peoples, and there were often multiple sub-racial groups within these categories. And believe it or not, these assumptions built on histories of the confounding term Caucasian, biblical exegesis, and philology. So Caucasian is another kill your keywords for me. A really fanciful 18th century German fabrication whose origins are anything but as straightforward as we think. Although its origins are generally credited to Johann Blumenbach in his ruminations on his 200 skull deep collection in his 1775 on the natural variety of mankind, this conclusion could not have been as impactful in and of itself had it not dovetailed with broader thinkings on race and racisms. And he may not even have been the first person to use the term. So Blumenbach honed in on Caucasian varieties due to the Caucasus Mountains, proximity to Mount Ararat, the resting place of Noah's Ark, and he assumed that these skulls might offer a glimpse into God's antediluvian design. In his case, though, he also praised the beauty of a Georgian female skull. He emphasized the beauty of Ethiopian skulls. So the terminology might not have taken off if not for a few factors. One, many European thinkers for whom this region was abstract, Christophe Meiners, Georges Cuvier, also used this terminology in relation to skulls and superiority. Caucasian also benefited from biblical bona fides, right, that provided a more palatable solution for philologists who had identified the linkages between Indo-European languages. So for instance, while earlier thinkers like Sir William Jones, Johann Gottfried von Herder, Friedrich Schlegel affirmed that, quote, the course of all languages, all thought, and all poetry of the human spirit, everything, even European race, everything stems from India without exception. Caucasian offered many Euro-Americans means to explain that it was the Caucasus, not the subcontinent or not the Himalayas, that was the real Garden of Eden, and therefore the cultural, religious, genetic origins of their lives. In other words, arguing that Indians and Europeans had diverged from a common ancestor, rather than Indians being the ancestors themselves, because they were too dark. So I'm belaboring these mental gymnastics to emphasize that Caucasian has really nothing to do with the actual peoples of the Caucasus, right? Nor does it have anything to do with, say, Scandinavia. Instead, it has everything to do with Europeans straining to acknowledge their indebtedness to Indian civilizations, refusal to countenance a non-white identity for ancient Egypt, and an even more powerful catch-22, right? That would acknowledge that the primary movers and creators of Jewish and Christian religion might have been substantively different from modern Europeans. Big claim. So fungibility and confusion among these many ethnic groups and a sense that these populations had mixed played out across the domestic and international arena. But again, it was within mixture as Caucasian, right? As opposed to being necessarily ethnically distinct, or religiously distinct. So when Pennsylvania Senator David Reed called Syrians, quote, the trash of the Mediterranean, end quote, in 1929, he was describing what he called a mix of Levantines, right, who have been racialized as sexually deviant, ethically and ethnically dubious, politically problematic, religiously backwards, right? Though not necessarily entirely racially distinct. So in the Near East, and to a lesser extent, Middle East were formulated. Oh, here's another one, another map of European races. This is from Madison Grant, who's the most famous American eugenicist. There's later a Madison Grant Society in Nazi Germany, right? So there's an incredibly rich is maybe makes it sound like a positive. There's a robust cross-pollination across the Atlantic, inclusive of both North and South America. The creator of this map, I came across it, and part of why I did this deep dive into race science was actually that the cartographer is an Armenian, Levon Dominian, born in Istanbul, and then comes to the States and creates these maps, but disagrees substantively with his boss in terms of the genetic and racial makeup of the Orient. So here's a map again showing, in other words, all of this, we only see European races, right? North Africa, Asia Minor, these are all different European races. They're divided up as Nordics, Alpines, and Mediterraneans, Cro-Magnons, right? But again, all European or Caucasian. This is Madison Grant, the man in question. Okay.
Wow.
This is an example of craniometry. So this is comparing, as you can see, Lebanese, I apologize, this is a little blurry and small. It's a graph of Lebanese and Armenian skull shapes, craniometry, comparing it both modern populations and to ancient reliefs. If you read this scholarship, which we were talking about at lunch, many do not, because it's incredibly dense, very verbose, and racist. They're obsessed with Armenians' sugar loaf shaped heads.
Oh yeah.
So I'm like, I often feel I feel my bald spot. I'm like, oh God, it's this flat spot. I'm a sugar loaf. So here you can see what they're in part what they're getting at through these Armenian men and Lebanese men and women. So in mobilizing these arguments, though, let me go back for a second. They weren't alone, right? Since there was a widespread investment in whiteness as a proxy for opportunity, civilization, and inclusion among multiple immigrant groups, right, who litigated for whiteness. So foundational texts in Hindu, Arab, Turkish, Armenian nationalisms claimed whiteness. As late as the 1940s, a Punjabi immigrant argued that he should be white because as a Muslim, his origins were actually Arab, right? And should join Arab Americans in being recognized as such. Again, this is not to underscore that there's a real race somewhere. We're just getting it wrong. But just to say these are just made up discourses, right? That have huge, incredible influence. I think they are the master category of US modernity, but they're incredibly unstable, right? Starting with this category of Caucasian. To give you a few surprising quotes, I don't want to belabor this too much, but here are two really preeminent German thinkers on race, Felix von Luschen and Hans Günther, who's the most cited Nazi ideologue. If you look at these quotes, the first one, noticing the surprising similarity of the European Jews with many Near Eastern Armenians, with the Syrians of northern Syria, with the representations of Hittite Arameans, the majority of Jews belong to this Near Eastern North Syrian type called Armenoid. The second one, Near Eastern race, originated in the Caucasus in the 5th and 4th century, millennia BCE, before spreading to Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The original race was preserved in its most hereditarily unadulterated form in modern-day Armenians, the most ungovernable people of all. This is a shout out for the Center for Armenian Studies and myself. But I bring this up both to flag two big things. Notice that we see incredible fungibility between these peoples. There's a sense, oh, there's this big bucket of Near Eastern race, which was often actually named Armenoid. And the first thing. And then secondly, we've missed this connection between Nazi race science and particularly the Jewish Holocaust and the Armenian genocide, which I would argue are parts of and parcel of the same discourse and share technologies of violence. But they've been framed in ways that are understood as completely disconnected and distinct. This is false. Also, an example, this is another Princeton shout out. Philip Hitti, who's the founder of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton, just to emphasize again, this is not to smear anyone, to say I really understand why people are making claims to whiteness, because it was a necessity for the rights to have rights, right? Moreover, it was the dominant understanding of how we should think about a huge literal from Morocco to Afghanistan, which we'll see still informs this category today. This is Philip Hitti. I don't want to belabor this because it's, again, incredibly unintelligible stuff. Northern Arabians are predominantly dolichocephalic, long-headed. Southerns are generally brachycephalic. The racial affinities of the people in the north, Mediterranean, Alpine, Armenoid, Hittite, Hebrew, blah, 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 right? So there's a sense of mobilizing these arguments and, again, suggesting that the region, whether rightly or wrongly, is incredibly mixed, right? But it's formed this sort of like composite genetic substrate that is shared across many, many, many peoples. And again, this scrutiny, or I want to be clear, this emphasis on Armenoids was not necessarily good, because prejudice underwrote restrictive housing covenants, immigration naturalization law, racial prerequisite cases mentioned above, and compounded by the horrors and degradations of the Armenian genocide, it meant that, for example, I'm thinking locally, Armenians, not Arabs, are written into restrictive housing covenants in Dearborn, for example, right at the turn of the century, because they're seen as being undesirables. Whereas whiteness? Arabs are able to move into Dearborn in part because in that moment they're understood as being white. And they are demographically predominantly Christian. So just to say, by the time we get to 1980, the mayor of Dearborn, Mayor Hubbard, says, we have to talk about our Arab problem. 1920 is a different moment, right? In which actually the discourse is incredibly dissimilar. It's an Armenian problem. Inflected by class, refugeedom, an understanding of religious or racial difference. But again, to really emphasize, these things are not stable categories. And just to kind of show, though, the ramifications of this, these categories still persist in white supremacist literature. I would say that my search history is surveilled by many Middle Eastern states, I am sure, but it includes things like this. So here's, again, you see that this is from a contemporary side. I pulled this a month ago. There's still incredibly specific, nuance sounds like a positive, not a pejorative, discussion of Armenoids are a distinct racial type. Here we can model what they look like. Orientalids are a distinct racial type. We can model what they look like, right? And this is, again, to the present day. So these prejudices underwrote foreign policy, colonization of the region, denial of Arab, Armenian, Kurdish, Azeri, other groups' voice at the Paris Peace Conference. But again, it's even from within the space of whiteness or Caucasianness, there's still a sense of being a lesser Caucasoid, right, which merited your not having full political participation. So for example, I want to flag for us like Sykes-Picot, another of these maps that looks it's the same region, kind of telescoped in on. As we all know, it divided up the region, but initially agreements with Russians and Italians included different control over Asia Minor, several versions of an Armenian state, a Kurdish state. And this is all to say that the map of the Middle East that we know today would have been impossible to predict 100 years ago. And in part, it's underwritten by these sort of demographic studies. Moreover, as I have elsewhere called groups geopolitical stature, this stature informed their inclusion in rights, both at home and abroad, at the Paris Peace Conference and in the United States. So for example, during the Depression, scholars have recently excavated, formerly Ottoman peoples were among the most deported, most intensely surveilled, and stereotyped through well-known themes of sexual deviance, Arabian Nights, and things like that. However, and this is another, again, moment of this confusion or contradiction, many Arab and Armenian actors work in Hollywood and are able to circumvent the Hays Code, which says you cannot have interracial romance on screen because they were not interpreted as being a different race, right? So in some ways, you actually see a lot of Arab and Armenians play South Asian, Native American, in some cases even Sub-Saharan African, and they are able to play those roles because it means that they can touch a white damsel in distress, which otherwise would not have been possible, right, for East Asian or Black Americans. So if World War I witnessed a tectonic shift in the region's demographics, World War II and the creation of myriad states instigated dramatic shifts in assumptions about the region's characteristics, its boundaries, and particularly it being the Middle, not Near East. So the popular press began employing Middle East or Mideast, and largely centered this analysis on Cairo, Beirut, or Jerusalem, particularly to report on the creation of Israel and the ongoing conflict between the Arab and Israeli states. At the same time, government definitions waxed and waned. During World War II, the US integrated the Saudis and Turkey into Lend-Lease, and despite the State Department also documenting that Turkey was supplying Germany, another one of these connections that I think are worth exploring. And definitions reflected, though, these strategic alliances. So, for example, in 1944, as you can see here, the State Department defined its division of Near Eastern affairs as including Greece, Turkey, Iraq, Palestine, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and the Arabian Peninsula, and the division of Middle Eastern affairs as covering Afghanistan, Burma, or Myanmar, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, India, and Iran. Later, the US government continued cozying up to Turkey, crushed leftist uprising in Greece, aligned itself with Israel, and wrote off those parts of the Balkans, Caucasus, and Central Asia behind the Iron Curtain, which shifted its map. So in 1948, it stopped using Middle East in favor of Near East, which you can see here. Greece, Turkey, and Iran are a different category, for instance, right? Which again, I would argue has to do with strong alliances with these states that makes them not different in this particular way, different, but better difference. And in 1974, it redefines the Near East to include some Arab League nations, Iran, but not Turkey and Sudan. This is kind of in the present day, which shows this is still the division of Near Eastern affairs. Again, it's still Near Eastern. There's not a division of Middle Eastern affairs in the State Department, for instance. So we see a serious mismatch today across government agencies. And the same is true of the Cold War. So in other words, these definitions weren't consistent. One example, which I want to highlight, a very American studies project. This is Hart-Celler. Hart-Celler, the Immigration Act of 1965, revolutionizes US immigration, right? By eliminating national origin quotas, the Asiatic barred zone. It defined the Middle East in a different way still. I would argue deeply idiosyncratically by combining the Near and Middle East, but also including Pakistan, which at that moment, Bangladesh, which in that moment, briefly, there is a union, or actually after the Indian and Pakistani independence, right? There's a union of Eastern and Western Pakistan, which is now present-day Bangladesh and Pakistan, which means that when the US defines the Middle East in 1965, at least in terms of immigration, it's in a totally different way that actually stretches to the subcontinent. This is later amended, but you see what I mean about like government agencies aren't agreeing on this category either. So this act shifted towards far larger number of Egyptian, Palestinian, Irani, and Yemeni immigrants to a US population that had been, as I said, predominantly Syrian, Lebanese, and Armenian. It provocatively also said that this part of the world was going to be a source of refugees, not citizens, right? Not normative citizens, without quite saying why, which is kind of a fascinating congressional like sleight of hand. But again, contradictorily, as federal agencies codified racial difference, which again is what this new category is amending, it consolidated the Middle East and North Africa as white, right, across much of this space, basically to Afghanistan, not inclusive of Pakistan, which is disaggregated and put in the Asian category, starting in the 70s and 80s. Importantly, these policy processes bridge these foreign and domestic imaginaries on university campuses through the creation of area and ethnic studies. So both were deeply influenced, as we well know, by Cold War geopolitics and organizing that emphasized enemies, the need to study areas in danger of falling to communism, but also emphasize on the leftist side of the political spectrum, third world and people of color paradigms that intentionally critiqued French, British, to a lesser extent, Spanish and Portuguese empires, but to a far lesser extent, Russian or the subsequent Soviet colonialisms, at least in leftist circles, right? So scholarship shifted away from Orientalist studies, in part as a result of funding sources, institutionalization, and a far more diverse political landscape that did not include the old empires anymore. And this is where Zach Lockman's work, I think, is so useful. So along with the SSRC, ACLS, Ford and Carnegie corporations, that's a typo, the US government opened up its coffers to fund new programs. Princeton, Columbia, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Michigan established intensive summer programs in Arabic, Turkish, and Persian. But the real boom in language study came when Eisenhower signed the National Defense Education Act in 1958, whose Title VI allowed Near and Middle Eastern studies programs to more than double by 1968. Title VI overwhelmingly funded Arabic and Hebrew language study, followed distantly by Farsi and even more distantly Turkish and Armenian. So this was the juncture at which Middle East studies as a field was constituted in 1967. But as we know, it incompletely replaced earlier Orientalist and Near Eastern. This is why we have a sort of coexistence of Near and Middle Eastern studies departments. So because I'm a weirdo, this is the Association of Arab American, weirdo is the wrong word, I'm a feminist, but this is the Association of Arab American University Graduates conference in Detroit in 1975. I encountered this because I study this woman here, Alia Hassan, who is the first director of Access. And in digging through the archive, I saw her. She is not a university graduate. She would not otherwise have been included within the organization. But in terms of gendered labor, she and Helen Najjar are staffing the registration desk. So I was like, this is academia in many ways. You have like the Arab grannies who like do the work while Edward Said like pontificates, who I love. But again, this is the story I want to uplift. So the US continued to carve out spaces of exception, right, for pro-US states and politically aligned freedom fighters in the region. For instance, this kind of infamous photo of Reagan with Mujahideen in Afghanistan, fighting the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So I offer that to say that the idea that the Middle East was a site of sort of unilateral or constant US animus really deserves serious qualification. So in addition to supporting folks like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the US supported conservative monarchies in Jordan, Iraq, Iran, the Gulf, and Israel. Citizens of those states largely sidestepped the animus that was reserved for bad Muslims or bad Middle Easterners. However, these ideological biases meant that the US participated in coups in Syria, Lebanon, Iran, and singled out Palestinian above all, as well as Armenian and Kurdish groups as terrorists. To the point, as Manija Muradian shows, the US very deftly welcomed Iranian students into the fold of imperial masculinity and whiteness before ejecting them as a result of leftist or anti-Shah organizing, and especially the Iranian Revolution. In 1986, INS, Immigration and Naturalization Services, created an Alien Border Control Committee contingency plan aimed at interning Muslim and Middle Easterners, but admitted the impossibility of deciphering political persuasions, religions, or even ethnicities. Still, the Congress, the White House, in a 1988 circuit court case, led by Rudy Giuliani and Kissinger, no less, singled out the PLO, really above and beyond all other groups, as a problematic foreign entity and forced the closure of its UN offices. So again, this is not to diminish the very serious power of the US state in oppressing peoples from this part of the world, but just to say that it's done so in an incredibly variegated, but an inconsistent way. That said, as US ethnic studies brought its categories to bear on trying to understand these processes in the rest of the world, it struggled to understand where people from this part of the world fit, given its dominant paradigms: white, Black, African American, Asian American, Native American, or Indigenous, or Latino or Chicano. As I said, though, the census participated in some of these elisions, and for decades did disaggregate Armenian, Arab, and Iranian peoples as Middle Easterners. However, by 1980, it lumped the whole region into Asian. Before course correcting, in 2000, it categorized all peoples from this part of the world as Arab, before also course correcting, showing, though, that, one, this was an erasure akin to Turk, right, as a grab bag, a catch-all, for people from this part of the world, but also really showing by 2000 just how totalizing and homogenous stereotypes of the Middle East as Arab and Muslim had become, despite these earlier histories of a far more multi-ethnic region. So we all know that a definitive moment in this racialization came as a result of 9/11 and the endless war on terror, which precipitated the rhetorical boogeymen and political cudgels of Sharia law, Islamic fundamentalism, and the trope of the Muslim terrorist. But I also want to name that, again, if you go through at the granular level, right, programs like NSEERS, the FBI directives to document mosques, the Student Exchange Visitor Information Systems, Operation Liberty Shield, the programs that created the stereotype of flying while brown, and attempted to target, men from Muslim and Middle Eastern and Muslim majority countries. We give too much credit to the government if we assume they can correctly identify the peoples it attempts to entrap, surveil, repress. Again, that is not to say that I am supportive of the government just doing a better job. That is not the goal. But it is to say that these confusions meant that these programs targeted Iranian Jewish rabbis, Oriental Orthodox priests, Christian minorities like Assyrians and Copts, East Africans, outside the formal definitions of the MENA region, Central Asians, Indonesians, etc. And moreover, we also saw Bush's Greater Middle East Initiative, which coincides with the war on terror, it creates yet another definition of what the Middle East is. So you see how there's like, again, substantial confusion being constantly generated by the federal government, even as it's attempting to target and legislate that the Middle East is a category of strict scrutiny, special analysis, important things. So again, as I said, this is not to say the US was justified in doing this, right? Or again, if it just could get its definitions right, I'd be down for it. No, it's to critique power and oppression, but just to say that we actually really don't have any consistent or meaningful definition of the Middle East as a place. Things I would argue continue to get worse in the 2000s in terms of popular culture's vilification of the region. A 2001 I didn't make this. I love this though. A 2001 Gallup poll indicated that 49% of Americans agreed that Arabs should carry special identification, 58% that Arabs should undergo more stringent security checks, which of course did come to pass by and large. By 2006, Palestinians had the lowest support, relative to Israel among Americans on record. That has shifted, particularly as a result of the last year, but certainly still remains broadly true. And as I have often taught, a 2015 public policy poll showed that nearly a quarter of Americans supported bombing Agrabah, which is, of course, the mythic city in Disney's Aladdin, which is why I have this image. Again, not actually funny, but like absurd. And notably, and this is where I think the election is particularly, poignant in many ways, but for our conversation today, Arabs, Iranians, and Armenians dramatically underreported their identities on the census during the first Trump administration in the American Community Survey, I imagine because there was fear, right, as opposed to any meaningful demographic shift. So I'm really curious whether the new administration will keep this MENA category, whether it will survive, and whether people will use it, particularly given fears of oppression. I want to also reiterate, though, that the census continues to move people on the back end where it thinks that they belong. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A, but I think there's a misconception about how much agency we actually have in classifying ourselves on the census. So here's where we get to the current category. And I'm wrapping up. As we've seen, the census has a notoriously, if not categorically, poor record, accurately capturing and understanding Oriental, Asiatic, Asian, MENA identities. And I would argue while the new MENA category is a step in the right direction, I would venture that its definitions and lack of engagement with the very people it claims to represent means that the development requires substantial amendment, scrutiny, and some degree of suspicion. Specifically, despite listening sessions, public comment, meeting with stakeholders, the OMB rolled out, that's the Office of Management and Budget, rolled out the category basically as it had proposed it a decade ago. And then kind of tested it a decade ago. So I might ask us, what do we notice missing from this MENA category? There are many things. There are many controversies we could talk about across the whole thing. Yeah. What do we notice missing in the MENA one? Anybody?
Well, Armenians and Turks.
Armenians are not there. Turks are not there. Bangladeshi, no longer there. Yeah. Oh, they would be captured in Asian.
Is there, but how is Israeli a race representative?
So Israeli is listed, right? Who is not listed? The dyad. Palestinians are not listed, right? So I bring this up only in that I think it's really, really interesting. We don't see Assyrian Chaldeans listed, right? A group that has litigated, has sued the federal government to be counted and specifically disaggregated. We see Kurdish, which I think is a fascinating development. This is why we have to delete this video. I know it is because someone at the census is like, oh, they're Kurds. That's all. That was it, right? So all to say that there's a degree of human subjectivity that is occurring here, right? That's not tied to demographic realities, right?
Politics.
And certainly politics, right? So not surprisingly, community members, leaders, experts, Middle East Studies Centers, the Arab American Institute, Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, Armenian American Action Network, National Iranian American Council immediately voiced their disappointment for many of the reasons that we have named. So really to wrap up, I want to just caution against the institutionalization of any category, but particularly this category, with the hope that it is emancipatory in and of itself, right? Or that it's suddenly getting things right. I think that as we've seen, no category. A category by definition excludes, right? And can do so in kind of problematic ways. I'd also hope that this would be an anchor for a boon of civil rights suits, that people could then bring against university campuses, other spaces where they felt discrimination that would now be understood as racial as opposed to religious, right? Because then we have far stronger sort of mechanisms for correcting racial as opposed to religious animus, at least in the history of American jurisprudence. And I'm aware of, I think, the new realities of people self-censoring or covering, to use Kenji Yoshino's term, to say, well, I might not want to identify in this way, particularly given the new administration. So I think that there is, in order to support a really new and more inclusive world, we'd have to really change business as usual quite substantially. I want to say, though, all is not lost. Edward Said described the all too familiar need for marginalized and minority groups to be given permission to narrate. And we are no longer the US of 100 years ago, right? MENA Americans are perfectly capable and qualified to speak for ourselves. And here's where I draw the most hope from the incredible work undergraduates, including here, are doing to build multi-ethnic and multi-religious coalitions to push for MENA cultural houses that celebrate rather than penalize difference. So despite my determinative cynicism, I am Armenian after all, I'm really even more stubborn in my conviction that a better, more inclusive world is both possible and necessary. And I think that this category gives us a real opportunity to think about its instability, to think about the constructedness of race, and especially to think about the failures of both the government and our own shared politics, ideologies, and the limits of our empathies, really across the political, ethnic, racial, and other kind of identitarian spectrum. So I want to leave space for questions, since I know I've covered a lot of material and probably raised more questions that I've answered. But I really hope that this is just one of many conversations that will come in the next several years. Hope building a more inclusive and more just world for not just MENA Americans, but everyone. Thank you. Please, Harry, I know you.
All right. I just had a few questions / comments. So first thing I wanted to tell a brief story. There's a municipality in this area that those who are local will know, Lathrop Village. And like many places, Lathrop Village once had restrictive covenants. In about 1955, 57, my grandfather decided to move the family from where they lived in Southwest Detroit, now part of Mexican Town, out to Southfield area where they were building St. John's, and where they were planning to build it eventually. And they bought a house in Lathrop Village where they were going to buy a house. And they said, well, you have to go to an interview with Mrs. Lathrop, who like owns Lathrop Village. So by a physical in-person interview, my grandfather goes to her and she says, oh no, you people are too dark to come live in this neighborhood. So of course he came home, furious and whatever. And so I was told this story. Actually, my family didn't talk about this kind of thing a lot at all. They were more like, scared to move on. But when I was told that story, I just investigated. So I had a cousin who had a house in Lathrop Village because after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it turns out Armenians moved there. And so I found the deeds and I looked at what exactly it said in the restricted covenant, and it had the most bizarre language that I then had to like look up some of those old, like the Madison Grant map to understand what they were even talking about. Because they said the way they worded it was, houses shall only be sold to members of the North Mediterranean race. So what does that mean? Does that mean the north side of the Mediterranean, like Italy, as opposed to Egypt? And it's like, well, what about Northern Europe? That doesn't make sense. So I found one of these old maps, and I don't really know which author. He had all of Europe and the Near East or Middle East or whatever called like the Mediterranean race. And then the North Mediterranean race was like Northern Europe, and the South Mediterranean race was, the Middle East, and as well as Italy, Southern Europe and stuff. And so it was just bizarre, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, no, and so I also dramatically oversimplified, the kind of the broadest consensus was that there's three, this was again, in this moment, the consensus was, oh, there are three main races. I want to also name for all of us, these are still the skulls that are used in forensics. Like, should you watch SV or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, or what is it called? The forensic show, NCIS, whatever, like they don't say this, but actually what you were still taught in forensics is that there are these three main skull types, and you can predict a victim's race by virtue of their being Asian, Caucasian, or Black, effectively, right? Which is born out of this
Right.
absolutely very, very dated thing. Yes, there are huge debates, though. Well, I shouldn't say huge, academic debates, but these are actually really quite popular books. So, William Ripley, for example, he retires and he's like, oh, well, my kids need to go to college. I better write a history of the races of Europe, which he does. And it's a huge seller. There are, inter-turf wars over, are there three European races? A Polish guy.
It's referenced in The Great Gatsby at the beginning of.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly. No, exactly.
He's like, oh, I've been reading this new book. It's called The Downfall of the White Race. You should read it.
Yeah.
And it's like a pastiche title that's not really a real book, but it's showing that popularity. The other thing I was going to say is, I was surprised that when you mentioned about how, like, all these groups were kind of just white, sort of, and then they became subcategorized, and they became not white, and that that's sort of like the alternative to some of the white studies theories that are in academia today. I mean, one of the big ones, I'm sure you know this, but is Hispanics. If I recall correctly, Hispanic and Mexican and whatever was put in under white up until the 1930 census, and they specifically made a category that said is Mexican at that time. So that was another interesting thing I would write by research. There was a brief time where I was working for this Arab American lawyer who wanted me to research how we could actually to do this, to try to get a category so that civil rights suits could be brought. I didn't work for him for that long, unfortunately, but I was researching this for a short period. And so that's my those were my comments. And then thank you so much. It was an excellent presentation. I should have led with that. It was really interesting, and I'm sure we all learned a lot from this, and it was a fascinating discussion. So thank you.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, and thanks for your comments. I mean, we talked a little bit about this. I visited Dr. Albertani's class, and we talked a bit about the category of Hispanic, Latino, and it's endured incredible variation as well over its history, particularly as a created category, that doesn't exist. Again, at least the governmental level. I'm certainly privileging the state in many ways, but that's why, again, we're talking about the MENA census categories. We're starting there,
Right,
but that's why I really want to also name. We see popular culture. We see, there's academia is really
Yes.
quite engaged in these
And I think
debates
the
as well.
culture has led, I would say that Arabs and Armenians and whatever, and Middle Eastern people, I keep saying whatever, I don't mean to sound it, say it in a rude sounding way. I'm just, how else do you want me to define it? But, it seems to me that popular culture started to define, let's say, Arabs or Middle Eastern people as not white before the census did. I mean, this started right after 9/11. And I remember, and I remember before 9/11, I'm old enough to remember before 9/11 and after 9/11, and it was like a different world. All of a sudden, if I was driving and I had like Armenian music on, which I played the, halftime type music, if I pulled up next to like a Ford F-150, I'd turn it down. I had nerve, but that was after 9/11 that happened.
Yeah.
Before, you were just kind of like, quirky to be playing music like that, but afterward it was like you were suspect.
Yeah. Sir, I saw you had a question, then ma'am, you have one as well in the back. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a really fascinating talk, and very timely, especially this week. I wanted to ask you about the op-ed you put on earlier. I was really curious, but I can't quite remember the details about it now, but it was the author, who I think correct me if I'm wrong, was arguing against a kind of Turkish whiteness and trying to get out of that category. And what my question was, I was just really curious, how often do you see, as these different ethnicities are vying, for the legal category of whiteness to become naturalized, how often do you see them like weaponizing that against each other?
Great question.
And the example that I kind of think of is on the poster of the silent film Ravished Armenia.
Exactly.
The white European Armenian woman being carried off by a brown
Yeah,
Turkish.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know, I should pull that up if I could quickly, but yeah, no, again, that is absolutely, that's a big part of Sarah Gualtieri's first book, Between Arab and White. A major thrust of her argument is, and actually Nedad Mokbule, like who wrote a book, The Limits of Whiteness, I think. I'm confused, also makes this argument that there's absolutely an instrumentalization or an othering of people. So it's very much like a hierarchical system. It is not in coalition or together racism is bad. The argument is not that. It ends up almost always being, well, no, you just gotten it wrong. We're white, they aren't white, and that happens vis-a-vis certainly in, say, Ravished Armenia, this film, Aurora Mardiganian, saying, oh, well, in the way it's represented. Elise Semerjan has an incredible chapter on this film in her new book, Remnants. I highly, highly, highly recommend. Where it does rely on like, well, no, we are white ones. We're Christian. These people are not. Of course, they confront the fact that Turks are also saying, well, no. I mean, we, at least say among young Turk leadership, are by and large European by birth, and say, no, we are Europeans. These are these like messed up indigenous peoples. That's why they're tribes. But of course, and then Persians or Zoroastrians, there's a sense of, oh, well, these are the people that we're going to vilify because they're really the uncivilized ones. So yeah, unfortunately, yes, the history is one of like stepping over one another as opposed to thinking coalitionally, with some exception, right? We do see a lot of coalition support the MENA category starting in the 90s. So there are moments of intergroup collaboration. There is, though, a lot of tension. A lot of the history is one of really, really quite contentious. So yes, the short answer would be absolutely. There are groups saying, no. Actually, we are the one, they're the problematic ones. Even though the state, as I said, is often miscoding or grouping peoples together. Ma'am in the back.
I immigrated here in 1973. And I remember I was 8 years old, teachers speaking over top of my head. And the one thing they agreed on was, we know she's not white. So this was 1973.
Yeah.
Before. I'm just wondering why we're even continuing to buy into this. I am a person of color. I don't care what you tell me. There's no way I'm white. When I came to Ann Arbor, I was 21 and I found out I was white. I went to apply for a job at the university and I called my siblings, we're white. Like, yeah, technically we're white.
Yeah.
You can't tell me that my experiences are that. So why? Sometimes I wonder, I don't like answering these questions because this is all bogus.
Yeah, no, yeah.
That really mean nothing.
Yeah. And that's why I tried to offer caveats, like I'm not saying these things are real. My argument is not like, oh, actually we are white. This is the thing. It's really just to say, look at how much these categories have shifted, the way we've narrated and understood them. We are constantly oversimplifying. No, right. They're constantly.
Why are they being created? Why are they being pushed? And why, this is the question so that we are aware of what goes on.
Exactly. No, I think that's, if I could offer, not that I want to, lead a horse to water, but yes, it is to say like, look, power is creating these, informing these categories. This is Said's argument in Orientalism, right? The fact that they are so immutable, the fact that they are deployed in ways that are deeply cynical by individuals, teachers, by the government, by immigration officials, right? With no consistency. One has to do with what some scholars have called the ocular event of race or the interpersonal, but also suggests there are other dynamics at play here, right? My point is not to participate in the tournament of oppressions and say, gosh, we all know that Armenians had a rough go of it, right? But I hope we all know that. I think we do here. But, it is to say, though, that the naming of Armenians particularly or singularly in US, as well as almost all of Latin American immigration law, occurs in that moment alongside gypsies. I would argue that this is not because Armenians are whiter or not whiter or anything. It's because Armenians are understood as being destitute, dirty beggars, to quote the Colombian journalist of the time period, so there's this deep kind of imbrications of class, assimilability, refugeedom that we don't talk about, right? In part because race is the master category, right? We understand everything in terms of these racial paradigms. But I want to argue, yes, race is, I think, the master category of the American legal system. But I would argue that along with gender, yes, I think this is it. However, we are ignoring the other dynamics at play here, or one you could say the intersectional dynamics of how we move through the world and how, again, these categories, a meaning is made, right? The law in and of itself does not make meaning. People performing it do, people enacting it do. And I think that's what you're getting at, is that.
I mean, on a practical level, at Ann Arbor Public Schools, we had Middle Eastern, and of course, Israelis could check that, Afghanis,
Yeah.
Pakistanis. And so about 12, 13 years ago, a group was established, and we changed the category to Arab, and that was the countries from the Arab.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what ended up happening was that our people were checking off more than one category, and then they were getting thrown into a multiracial category, and there's just no way to sort this.
Yeah,
out
yes,
on a
yes, yes.
practical level.
Yeah, so I was going to say also, just an FYI, there has been proposals or suggestion that the census will roll it out. Again, I don't know that it will actually end up happening, but akin to the Hispanic Latino category, such that it is seen as an ethnocultural category that would allow people to check multiple options to say, well, I want to be white and Middle Eastern, I want to be Black and Middle Eastern, which on the one hand allows for people to have greater agency over their identifying, but in terms of statistical analysis, or kind of, it does complicate the story, as you said, you know, and there's such substantial confusion about the category that, yeah, I think it will require a lot of education among community, you know, at the community level, right? To say, okay, this is what this means, this is how you navigate it, whatever. And I don't think people would know that now. You're saying they no idea how to navigate this now, yeah.
Well,
Oh,
two questions from.
oh,
Yeah, I just want to thank you so much. This was really great and informative. And I had two questions that I kind of wanted to link in the Armenian element to it. And I know you didn't touch on this presentation, but having known you for a little while and talking to you about this, I'm really curious. First, about this presentation, you mentioned that Armenians were hesitant to, or were underreported on the census because it appears along with Arabs and Iranians. My question is why Armenians were hesitant, if you have that answer, or any type of information on that. And another question is, I know there was, and you're the one who educated me on, it's like a movement to include Armenian in the census, like as a a subcategory of white or MENA or something on its own. And I know there was a lot of debates and discourses within Armenian groups and organizations about, are we under white or are we under Eastern? I understand that because my dad's from Syria, my mom's from Armenia. Which one am I? So like, what was the discourse about? Was there so much fighting that there wasn't a final consensus? Did there need to be? Did it make a difference?
Yeah. So I would answer these questions maybe connected to one another, right? You know, and I think I didn't focus the talk on Armenians per se, you know, because I was thinking really with Near and Middle East, you know, and like those being the categories that are being produced by the academy, the government, et cetera. But of course, I'm happy to talk about Armenian specific things. Yeah, so I think first, there are a few things that I want to name that I think would be useful for the Armenian audience, right? You know, here particularly. And this is something which I don't think as a community we have done in a really substantive way. Is one, engage race and what these things mean or don't mean, first off, right? This we should do. But two, I think there's a tendency, and I'm very, very fortunate and grateful to have started this project with the AGBU, which has given me a different access, and frankly, is now my job to really understand the globality of Armenian communities, right? Which have already shown me a few really key things. One, as I said, race. Two, there's a tendency, I think, to project our own individual and idiosyncratic experiences as a universal experience. And that, I think, plays out in a huge, I mean, this is true of any human, right? But I think that among Armenians, in part as a result of trauma, there's a sense that, oh, there must be a singularity. There must be a singular Armenian identity, right? Both that we must intentionally gather, consolidate, normalize, formalize, right? You know, post-genocide, right? To try to gather and reconstitute worlds that were shattered, right? And also, I think we're far more diverse than Armenianness is understood today, by and large, right? What I mean to say there is that I think there's been a tendency to say, oh, Armenians from X place in the old country, right? This is the normative Armenian. And I've been frankly bewildered to see myself, wow, actually, a sense of Armenian food or language or religious practice or phenotype is not normal, or there's not a normative iteration of that, right? In ways that I'd be scandalized if someone said, no, dolma is Middle Eastern. I don't know what Armenian food is though, right? But that's all to say that there are such distinct geographic variations based on, again, the different, often imperial systems in which Armenians lived that have created these profound kind of linguistic, cuisine, cultural differences that we struggle to kind of like reconcile. You know, we've seen it for hundreds of years, the emptying of the kind of core of Armenia, starting with, not to really belabor this and go back in history, but starting with like, you know, Turkic invasions, whether it's like, you know, the Seljuks or the Ottomans, you know, and the dispersal of Armenians westward, which occurs with the support of the Byzantines, right? We also see then the dispersion as a result of the Jalali revolts because of famine, because of plague, because of the Ottoman-Persian wars that are occurring at the end of the the end of the 16th and 17th, you know, centuries. So there's this huge processes of dispersal that actually go back even earlier, right? We see that Armenians are moved by the Persians in the 5th century, right? So that's all to say that I think that there's a huge dispersal in the way we think about identity must be comfortable with plurality in a way that I don't think Armenians often have been as a result of the genocide. In terms of stateside, I found there's also huge differences in terms of how different geographic spaces understand themselves, particularly racially. You know, what I mean is there's a tendency in terms of, say, California Armenians. The Armenian lobbies, Armenian organizations there, by and large, were pro-MENA category. Ones in the Northeast were not. You know, so there are ways also that your geographic space in the US has also deeply inflected how Armenians understand themselves in relationship to these categories. I think also time and generations actually have also shifted this. Across these groups, inclusive of Armenians, younger folks identify more as non-white than older folks. But again, that's not to say that immigration status also is a facet of this that has nothing to do with age, right? Are you coming from a Soviet system in which you might be European, but also a quote, dirty black Caucasian, right? You know what I mean? Which again is a discourse that circulates, certainly in, say, Moscow, right? Even with intra-Armenian discourse, right? If people are too dark versus, you know, so these things I think we all know are happening. We don't talk about them in a public way because they are so much shameful, right? And they get it, again, they expose difference, right? Which Armenians, I think, are uncomfortable with. So again, that's kind of the bigger question. I think in terms of this particular kind of disidentification, right, or underreporting, I just know this because I've gone through a lot of the American Community Survey statistics that I was like, what's happening here? And I just noticed that there was suddenly this major dip in terms of these groups stemming, like, again, self-reporting on the census that did not coincide with any outflow of peoples. I think there are a number of reasons. There was, again, kind of increased anti-immigrant sentiment. If you know, like Citigroup last fall, right, was fined for intentionally discriminating against Armenians. But again, that's particularly localized experience, right? That I think means that likely the people in certain spaces were like, oh, I shouldn't be checking this because like I'm in danger, right? Or this is a bad thing. Whereas others in other geographic spaces or other generational identities were like, no, why would I not? I'm proud and I feel safe enough to do that, you know? So again, that's not to give you any like real definitive cause and effect, but I think that this is so different. You know, how would I have, well, I shouldn't tell you this. I mean, now I'll get more surveilled. I have a city, you know, like credit card, right? You know, and I have an Armenian name. I haven't experienced discrimination or I didn't have my accounts closed, but many Armenian Americans did. Why is that? You know what I mean? Like, so I would not know, oh, I should hide this. They might have felt a pressure to hide an identity in order to open a banking account, right? Yeah.
Actually, well, this was a fabulous talk, as always.
Oh, thank you.
You know, bringing up all these amazing things. And the weaponization of race, of course,
Yeah.
is very much at least coeval with the rise of the West, the Enlightenment, and the colonization of the rest of the world. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, that Du Bois talks about the global color
Yeah,
line,
yeah,
basically,
yeah.
is there. And that is when I think knowledge and power intersect in a true way. To
Yeah.
marginalize a lot of people. And of course, in that context, I was a part of the US Census Bureau. They
Yeah,
invited
yeah,
me
yes.
15 years ago when we were discussing these categories. I had no idea what was in store. And I mean, the most surprising things were, on the one side, the Israelis said, hey, we're of European origin. So what are you talking about? We're white, of course. And then there were also East African ones, and they're saying, we are a part of the Middle East. And they kept saying, no, but you should be a part of Africa. And they said, no, we are both culturally and otherwise, with you. So then I realized, and of course, it's very socially constructed.
Yeah.
A lot depends on the intersection of categories. And I also think the fact that Jesus, of course, comes from the Middle East and is sort of, and among Christians, European Christians are sort of, Western Christians are in hegemonic positions.
Yeah.
It's in their interest also to identify, Jesus as white, and he probably wasn't, of course.
Yeah. No.
But far be it from us to say that,
Yeah. And that's a major part of these court cases, even in the
Yeah.
assenting, opinions, right? And that's why I wanted to kind of flag, we see these histories of philology, race science, biblical,
Yes.
exegetical practices that together, I think, make it very, very difficult to make the space non-white, right? For a number of reasons.
I'm just wondering, my question is there a difference in terms of race between Western Armenia and Eastern Armenia? Because one comes from the Ottoman tradition, the other from the more Russian tradition.
So you mean in terms of identifications then, right? Or, I mean, that's in part, I guess, another way to get at an answer to your question. I will say that, and that this is a huge, topic, but, the fact that I think that Iran is so invested in discourses of Aryanism, means that Iranians as a group also display substantial ambivalence about whiteness and non-whiteness, because this was the official Shah regime, both Shahs, like discourse around these sort of Aryan as opposed to Islamic origins. So I think that inflects Armenians and in turn understanding of, well, okay, I think frankly, as I also tried to flag in the talk, the fact that the Middle East becomes so synonymous, particularly in a Soviet Armenian context or now Republican Armenian context with Arabness and Islam, I think there's also a disidentification with that as being a possible space where, say, opposed to my family, was like, well, of course we're Middle Eastern. Where else are we from? We're from a city in Mesopotamia. Like, and to not be so would to my family, for instance, again, this is to be idiosyncratic, not universal, would be to embrace or de-indigenize ourselves. Versus, I think, what I see circulating is, again, claims to indigeneity, which I think are valid, right? To be clear, for, say, Caucasian Armenians who would say, oh, but to be Middle Eastern would then to be a mismatch and suggest we are not indigenous, right? So I think that because this gets at what we've talked about many a time, that the other sort of dominant paradigm of the nation state means that we do not have, with some exception, notice we have Kurdish, right? And again, Assyrians are also listed as a transnational indigenous group in the census standards. So there's some nod to the possibility of being non-hegemonic, you know what I mean? Or not in the separate nation state bucket. I don't think Armenians are there though. In terms of both our kind of intra-Armenian discourse as well as the census level. Yeah. I know you had questions online.
We have a couple of questions lined up online, and I'll apologize to those attendants if I not sort of bring up any all of them because of for the sake of time. But let me just at least bring up a few. First, let me start with a comment here. I worked for I worked for the Canadian census.
I love it.
68 to 83. I had seen earlier census publications, 1891, 1901, that separated Armenians as an ethnic group. That's at a time where groups had to be coded manually and tabulated likewise. The category was dropped in later censuses. I'm proud to say that in the Canadian 1981 census, Armenians were allowed to add manually their ethnic group appurtenance. as well as their mother tongue and the language they spoke at home. While these categories are not all found in printed publications, they are available to researchers through special request tabulation. I don't know
Yeah,
if you want to.
no, just a brief response. I love that question, or I love that comment, and I think that I've taught actually some of the Canadian census publications in class before, just to show, again, to kind of parochialize the US, even our northern neighbor, now here quite close, to really show that they're just totally different, really, really quite different legal formations in a few kind of key ways. I would say one, Armenians in Canada are actually tend to be more excluded because they're still coded as Asian until mid-century, when we see an influx of particularly Egyptian Armenians who flee nationalism under Nasser. So we see, of course, there's huge, especially Egyptian and Lebanese Armenian communities, particularly in Montreal. It's a much more closed door in the case of Canada than the US through the first half of the 20th century. Now, however, Canada has created totally different categories that include West Asian, that is primarily Turkish, Armenian, Iranian, and then Arab as a distinct category for which they are publishing reports and tracking data. So it offers just a different formulation, that is not US near, not US middle, Eastern, it's something totally different. Canada is really useful to think with. Again, there are just different ways one could do this, right? We could be West Asian. I didn't offer that as something, which again, Swana is something which many activists have taken up to invoke Asia as opposed to middle or Easternness, which again, Canada is kind of doing in its way. Yeah.
Yeah, there's one question that is actually, I would say, more of a comment as almost like a conclusion, asking who came up with this ridiculously discriminatory categorization. I think we're also scratching our heads over that.
Do you mean race in general, or like? Yeah,
we're talking about.
Oh, yes. I could obviously talk about this all day since I've spent my whole life obsessed with US race. I think that, we see that there are a few kind of salient, legal distinctions that are made in the colonial period around Black codes, and praying Indians, right? Native Americans who convert and are sedentary or sedentarized, right? As opposed to those who are nomadic. Even earlier, we see in Spanish colonial systems, there's also intense debate over, our native peoples, frankly, enslavable is the discourse they're having, right? Okay, well, they're not because they might be they might be a lost tribe. How do we fit them into this sort of, I should say, a unigenetic or biblical hierarchy of peoples? We shouldn't enslave them. Sub-Saharan Africans, maybe North Africans, we can, right? So I would say it really, really goes back to what are the founding sins of the US. The genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of African chattel slavery are really the origin of these categories writ large. And then again, as many, many, many scholars have repeated, the creation of or limiting of citizenship and naturalization to free white persons. Again, as a contradistinction, without ever really defining what whiteness is, except paradigmatically as something that it's, or syntagmatically as something it's not, right? So I think that's really would be my answer, but this is hundreds of years old, yeah.
So let me pose one last question. That comes from Mark Mamigonian.
Hello, Mark. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. Do you feel the gradual shrinking of the Armenian communities of the Middle East will affect the sense of identification with MENA as a category?
Absolutely, yeah. And so this is something which I say with real sadness. You know what I mean? Both personally, because my family did teach me, again, but this also speaks to Islamophobia in many ways. When I was a child, I was taught to identify. I grew up in South Florida, to think about geographic specificity. I was born outside of the country, but I really grew up in the States. My parents are citizens. I constantly asked about my identity, starting with being the interfacing with the world, right? And dutifully, my mother told me, well, you're Middle Eastern, but not Muslim. Again, as a way to identify in a particular way that felt authentic, but sidestep, which she imagined presumably as being the animus that I might receive if I just said Middle Eastern, right? So one, I feel personally, that would make me sad, and I think that should Armenians not make irredentist claims, but will say, if you identify as Western Armenian and from particular spaces, which include present-day Turkey and Syria primarily, Well, to not be Middle Eastern would be a tragedy because the genocide would have worked, would be my personal take on this, right? To answer really though the kind of more mechanical or mechanistic, aspect of this, yeah, I think that is absolutely a part of where the census logic, and I will say again, this video will self-destruct after I finish speaking. In conversations with the Census Bureau, with the Interagency Working Group on Race and Ethnicity Standards, there is a sense that Armenians are from the Republic, again, because of this nation-state paradigm. And that is very, very much distinct from moments, say, in the 70s and 80s when Armenians, along with Palestinians and Kurds, were singled out as terrorists because of Asala, the Armenian Secret Army for Liberation of Armenia, because of their collaboration with the PLO. As I kind of alluded to, the PLO was singled out, and everyone who orbited anywhere in that orbit was designated a terrorist, right, group. This is part of why the Armenian Republic is initially on the list of suspect countries post 9/11. Armenian Americans, of course, again, no country should be surveilled. That's why I don't know how to like sidestep this. I'm not suggesting again that like countries should be subject to special scrutiny, but Armenians protest and Armenia, the Republic, is taken off. But there is absolutely a shifting logic that as Armenians are generations removed from places that again are understood as near or Middle Eastern, and because the communities in the Middle East have faced such endless cycles of violence, civil war in Lebanon multiple times, the Syrian civil war, the persecution in Turkey, like there are real dynamics by which Armenians in the region are dwindling demographically. And I think that does inform a disidentification with the region. It encourages others to also not see Armenians as being of the region. So I think it's, kind of like, it's a dual reinforcing mechanism. If outsiders are telling you, well, you're not Middle Eastern, and increasingly people have more and more distance, whether because of generation or temporal or geographic scope connections to the region. Sure, I think there will be a dwindling. I don't know that I don't believe it is the correct strategy, but again, I certainly think it's unfortunately a natural consequence of.
But this is a huge problem because then it diminishes the fact that Armenians are indigenous to the region and all of our history there and everything. But I'm sorry, I spoke about raising my hand.
No, I mean, no, I'd be inclined to agree. And that's in part where, again, not to offer a particularly like a polemic here of my own perspective, but it is to say, like, I want to name that the Near East and the Middle East, when they are constituted, Armenians are understood as so central that they are named as like, this is the race of the Near East. Everyone was actually original. I mean, and people make outlandish claims, frankly. Leon Dominion.
Can I say one more thing? I'm sorry.
Yeah, please.
So one of the things I started thinking about it, now I came back because you said that. So when you mentioned, how there's not solidarity between all these different Middle Eastern groups, they're stepping over each other to decide who's white, who isn't white, which is true. That's what happened. To a degree, but there is some solidarity, and I'm assuming that the reason there wasn't solidarity is because obviously, as we all know, over in the Middle East, we were all fighting each other all the time, persecuting each other, and there wasn't, that's especially between Christian and Muslim, for example, there wasn't a lot of solidarity feeling, certainly back there, and then here there wasn't either. Now, in modern times, depending on who you're talking about, Palestinians, for instance, have solidarity with each other, regardless of religion, but we're talking about the 1920s after the First World War. It's a different world. And so I would think that was a major part of it, which brings up a very interesting point of, you mentioned how the Armenoid category was used to define, to describe, as a box to put in not just Armenians, but Middle Eastern people, and also the Jews. Now, not to, open a Pandora's box, but if we look, and you mentioned that the Holocaust is connected to the genocide in this same racializing way. If you look at all the Nazi cartoons or any caricature ever of Jews, it's always with Middle Eastern, quote unquote, stereotypical features: curly, dark hair, dark complexion, large nose, etc., etc. I mean, we're gonna laugh, and so. But then to say that then that means that Jews are racially Middle Eastern, then somehow to have a solidarity with then the Muslim population. I mean, this is just like such a nightmare of how to go forward with this, that I don't even, you know what I'm trying, I'm trying to say, like, everyone is suffering in this categorization.
Yeah. I know, I hear what you're saying, and I hear like a pragmatic bent. You know what I mean? Just say, oh, how would we instantiate or create solidarities? You know, I agree. Yeah, it's incredibly challenging. You know what I mean? If I agree, as we should feel solidarity with many, many, many different peoples, but particularly feel solidarity and unite in this system being something that harms all of us, right? You know, and just again to think kind of historically about this. I think we also really need to think about again. So it's like, why are these categories created? You know what I mean? Like, who is doing them? Why are they being like endlessly kind of like repeated? And why is this an iterative process? Again, if you look at the history of the MENA region for sure, and this is not to sound paranoid, but like main central planks of Ottoman, French, English, Persian statecraft rely on division. Right? Whether it is ethno-religious or confessional identities, whether it is racialized identities, right? They're
And so how does that
national
play
identities,
into
right?
to the conflict in Israel and Palestine right now?
Mhm.
Is the way forward to have peace between the Jewish people and the Arab Palestinians or whichever group of Arabs? Something along the lines of, this is a conflict that was created and sold to us by colonialism from the West, that now we have now embraced
Yeah.
and engaged in, and how do we extract ourselves from this to find ourselves at peace in the future?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because really, we're all Middle
Blame it on the
Easterners, and
West.
we're all indigenous at some point to this land, and I don't want to say that it's that okay that what the Israelis do. I'm just, you know what I'm trying to say? Because,
Yeah.
and it's also a practical thing too, because you're not gonna drive Israel into the sea, so let's be real. So,
I love we're ending on this. Wow, really, Wade. Yes. Again, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. I was like, I'm not a segue. Wait for a moment. Yeah, we have to wrap up soon, right?
I think we strategy.
Yeah.
Strategy.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
just saying,
One more comment.
hey,
Actually,
man, they're gonna say it in Ann Arbor, we're gonna say it.
there is actually a connection between the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Important, because ultimately, the first genocide because I work on genocides. The
Absolutely.
first genocide is the Herero genocide
yeah.
in South Africa.
yeah,
And there
yeah.
were German officials and officers there. They then came to the
Yep.
Ottoman Empire
yeah.
During the
Yeah,
World War One, and that is when they literally instigated, along of course with willing Turks, to actually have the Armenian genocide.
Yeah.
Then they went to Germany, and during Second World War, they were also working with Hitler. So that, you know, I, for a long time, wanted to have a student who would trace.
I was gonna say, no, my dream is to find like the smoke. And again, you find some German who could do this. I don't, my German's not good. I mean it seriously though, in that
Yeah.
I was like, I dream of finding a smoking gun of someone. And thank you for bringing this up, right? Because again, there's a way that the genocide of the Herero Nama is often
Exactly.
erased in discourse around the Armenian genocide, which is deeply problematic.
Yes. Yeah.
I appreciate that, for example, scholars like Hachi Muradian are now really emphasizing the concentration camp as a technology that is replicated across the Spanish-American War and Spanish oppression in Cuba, that is then recreated in terms of Herero Nama and Armenians and Jews, right? So there are ways that, again, empire and history rhymes, right? And I think that is really where I'd say this is where I would try to envision solidarity, say, okay, look, if we agree that certain things like genocide, which is a red line for me, and one would think is an easy one, right? That's bad. Okay, where do we start from that premise? You know, how do we fight that? You know? Do you have anything quick you want to say in the back?
I have a lot of stuff.
Okay, well, we can talk afterwards, because I want to respect people's time since we've gone over.
Let's give Thomas a.
Yeah, thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.